Hey Aubrey, how's everything going today?
Excellent. How are you, Lindsay?
Oh my gosh, I am in a super recording day. I've been recording for the last 3 hours. This is like episode 9 for me.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
recorded with Michelle before me, right? So it is a red
Yes,
letter day. A lot of recording
I'm
for
in the
you
zone
today.
today. I'm in
Oh,
the zone today. It's good. It's good. So Aubrey, what do you call your parents? What would you say? Let's talk about communicating with our elders today.
so I call my parents mom and dad. It's interesting. I just was hanging out with a family who all of their children said father every time
Oh
they
my gosh.
wanted to, and it was so different for me because almost everyone I know would say dad, hey dad, but every time it was father, and it felt so formal to me, but it was just clearly what they're used to. It's interesting.
Yeah, I remember discovering that someone, kind of a friend, like a friend of a friend, who we ended up at her ski house one weekend, and her dad showed up and she called him father, and we were shocked. We were like, wow, that is old New England.
Mhm.
And maybe old US culture. For me, it also has a connotation of wealth, actually, I think.
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
think. Doesn't have to be true, but from where I've
Mm.
seen it among, like, very wealthy families saying that, "father." Um
Interesting, and that does ring true for the family that I was hanging out with. He's like
Uh-huh,
a
uh-huh.
banker who they're
Yeah,
traveling all
yeah.
the time. They lived in
It's
Singapore and now Hawaii, and
Yep.
they were fantastic people, absolutely wonderful, but
Of
that's
course.
true. It's interesting. That's something interesting to think about if there's a correlation there.
So, I'm not saying there is, right? I'm not saying there has to
Right,
be, but
no.
check it out. I would encourage our listeners to check it out. See what do you observe? Like, what do these words say
Mhm.
about the culture of the family? Fascinating.
Well, and here's
Yeah.
another question. What do you call your friends' parents, especially when you
Mhm.
first meet them? Like, I don't think I would be comfortable, especially when I was younger, using a first name right
No,
away. What about
yeah.
you?
Yeah, I always called them by their last name, like Mrs.
Mhm.
Healy or Mrs. Selby.
Mhm.
I think as you get older and you go to your friends' houses, it might become more acceptable for a high school kid, especially towards getting out of high school, to call the friend's parent by the first name. What do you
Yeah,
think, like,
I
as you get
know. This so
older?
we're gonna dive into this today because I think there are a lot of aspects at play, right? It depends on the people, it depends on the culture. So we're gonna
Yeah.
get into this today. It's gonna be interesting, and we definitely want to know what this is like in your culture. So this is on YouTube. Come to the YouTube video and leave a comment. Let us know, what do you call your parents, your friends' parents? What is this like in your culture? We definitely want to know. We're answering a listener question today about what to call friends' parents in English. We'll give a
Mhm.
general rule that we follow to make sure you're always respectful,
Right.
but it's going to be interesting. We're going to talk about why it's so different depending on the family, the person, where they live.
Yeah, and today now, let me ask you a question before we get into this, Aubrey. Today, is this more from the perspective of if our listeners have children who are visiting friends' houses, talking to their, or is it for even our listeners as adults if they meet their elderly parents, like
We're gonna get
older
into
parents?
both for sure.
Both.
It
Okay.
will be more, yeah, if you're traveling to the United States, what should
Mhm.
your children do? And also, what should you do? I think it's
Right.
good to know both. So, yeah,
Cool.
let's cover
Cool.
both for sure.
I know a lot of our listeners are living in the States, right? You guys are
Mhm.
living here, and maybe all of your friends, your kids' friends are from the States. So, this is where you could get some information on how to
Yeah,
instruct your kid. Like, what are the cultural norms? This is gonna be cool. Um,
absolutely.
but I do wanna remind our listeners that we have an app. Sometimes we forget that we have an app,
I
but we
know.
have an app. We have and Aubrey, you always select our vocabulary words. Tell us a little bit about the power list, the
Yes,
vocabulary
exactly,
power
right?
list.
So for every episode, I'm selecting less common vocabulary, high level vocabulary that you might not know the definition to. And then you get to click on it. If you're following along in the app, you can listen to the episode while you see the transcripts, which is so
Mhm.
helpful. And then you choose this vocabulary. You can add it to your personal power vocabulary list so that it's super
Yeah,
easy to access. You see the definition and an example sentence. So instead of having to spend all this time looking up in the dictionary or
yeah.
having, it's so nice to have it organized so that you can refer to it later and then actually use it in your conversations.
Yeah, your vocabulary all in one place. So good to come back and it feels like home. You come back to All Ears English. Oh, there's the list. These are the episodes, the words from yesterday, last week, and then you can eliminate them once you've mastered those words. So, guys, go to allearsenglish.com/app. All right. We do have an Android version and an iOS version. Tons of listeners are in there, members, monthly members, getting that personal power list and getting those transcripts. Good stuff.
Yes, absolutely. Get that app today. You will not regret it.
All right, so this question then comes from Aya from Japan, and she left us a 5-star review, Aubrey, in Apple Podcasts. We love that.
Yes, thank you, Aya. I know we love your reviews. We love your ratings. Thank you guys. That helps others find us as well. And it just makes our day. So thank you.
It makes our day. And she says, I love your podcast. It's fun and helpful. I have a question. What do you call your friends' parents? When I was in Hawaii, a friend of mine told me that I should call her mom Auntie blah blah, right? Auntie something, and her dad Uncle something. I wonder if it's common in all places in the US. Great question, Aya. So
Yes,
good.
so interesting. Such a great question. We are going to dive into this, give you guys lots of interesting cultural information today. But we do want to share about a couple of recent related episodes. This is so cultural. And we
Mhm.
recently shared a really fun episode, 1947, about K dramas, 3 ways to talk about K dramas in English. And that it was so interesting to think about what are things like in other cultures. And when you watch K dramas, when you watch foreign films, you learn so much about the culture. It would be
Yeah.
interesting to compare, right? How in those TV shows, in those movies, are parents being referred to versus US culture versus your culture.
Oh my
So some of these
gosh.
episodes we do, there's so much to think about.
It's true. Think about how much you learned as a kid. What were some of your shows that you liked to watch as a kid, Aubrey? Do you remember, like,
Mm.
just one, for example?
I loved Jem and the Rockers when I was really young. Do you remember that one?
I
It was
remember the doll. I remember there was
There
a
was a doll, there
doll.
was a TV
Yeah.
show, and I would wake up really early because it was on at, like, 6 AM on Saturday mornings. So I had to wake up really early or I would miss it. If I slept till 7, I would be so sad that I missed Jem and the Rockers. It was like a cartoon about this rock band of girls. They were,
That's
like,
pretty cool.
really, really tough girls. I loved them.
Wow, that's cool. So we learn a lot about our own culture from what we watch, right? So check
Mhm.
that episode out. And then we also talked about this is also a cultural episode talking about names, right? How to address someone. And episode 1956 was the number. It's how to choose your English name. So go back into our archives, guys. Type these in the search bar, especially if you're in the app. You can search very quickly and find these episodes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
the first thing we're going to dive into is Hawaiian culture. Because if you
Mm,
haven't visited Hawaii, you might not realize that the culture is different in Hawaii to the rest of the continental United States. And this is a
I
big
love that.
one. A family I know from Hawaii, they do call their friends' moms auntie. Just like that, right? And it's
Yes.
so sweet. It's so endearing. I sort of wish that were more the case in the rest of the United States, but this is
Yeah.
pretty specific to Hawaii, right, Lindsay?
Yeah, I like that we're calling out Hawaiian culture as just being different, being
Mhm.
different from the rest of the US. Very important point, Aubrey. Absolutely.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
if you
Yeah.
travel to Hawaii, you're going to hear this, you're going to notice it. Now you guys are going to understand what that means. In Hawaiian, they do use auntie for an actual aunt. So, like your mother's
Okay.
sister, they'll call her auntie, but also their friends, they're like mom's friends. They'll call them
Okay.
all auntie too. So, don't get confused. They're not all their actual aunts or aunts. They just sort of call anyone that there is about their mom's age auntie.
And they just say auntie and then the first name, is that right?
Sometimes, or,
Or
when, we were
just
playing this
auntie?
game with the family and they were like, "Oh, you hit auntie with the ball." It's
Okay.
it's like they
Okay.
use it as a substitute pronoun instead of like you hit her with the ball. You hit auntie
Interesting.
with the ball. They didn't say Auntie Nelson, right?
That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, you see that a little bit less, quite a bit less kind of in the within other parts of the US,
Mhm.
mainstream US culture. So that's kind of a special subculture a little bit, niche.
Exactly, right,
Cool.
interesting. So, it's good to know. I sort of wish we had something like that in the United States because our option is, Mrs. Nelson,
I
which
know, it sounds
sounds
so formal, right?
Formal, right. So I kind of wish we need to adopt that, right? We need to adopt some Hawaiian culture into the rest of the country.
Right, because if you're especially if you're let's say you're 12, it feels a little weird to use a first name because there still is that big age gap, right? The mother's
Yes,
35 and the kids it's not quite right a lot of times. It's okay for
exactly.
some people, but not for everyone.
Yeah.
Um,
So I think as a general rule, right? Let's first talk about sort of younger kids. When they're first meeting someone, the
yeah.
best way to always be respectful is like you said, Lindsay, like we would always say when we were younger, Mrs. or Mr. and their last name, Mrs. Jones, Mr. Jones. And then they might say, "Oh, call me Marie, call me
Mhm.
Bob, or call me Auntie," whatever they
Right.
want you to call, right? If whatever you use is a little too formal, it's not
Yeah.
going to be a problem. It's not offensive, then they will let you know what they would want to be called.
Yeah, so if our listeners are listening, if you have kids in school, maybe give them this instruction. This is what you could do. Always go a little more formal and then pull it back and become more casual if the parent says that's okay,
Yeah,
right?
and it's so
Yeah.
tricky for kids. I know sometimes I'll say, "Oh, you can call me Aubrey," and they'll still keep calling me Mrs. Carter, or they'll just say Gigi's mom. They're like, "Gigi's mom, may I have some water?" Because they don't know what to say. They're worried about being disrespectful. It's so
That's pretty
tricky.
funny. Oh, that's cute.
What
Oh.
do you think about so sometimes if someone's younger and you tell them, "Oh, call me, Lindsay," and they
Mhm.
keep calling you Mrs. McMahon, do you feel like that's all what do you think about that?
I don't know. I think it wouldn't really bother me, right?
Mhm.
Just because 'cause they're kids and they're just doing their best.
Right.
Right? But, it might make me feel a little old.
Right. And then if they're older, right? If it's a young kid, we're very forgiving, but if they're older and they keep calling even after you said, "Oh, call me Lindsay," and they keep
Right.
calling you the
Distance.
missus, then it feels like there's this wall of professionalism,
Wall.
of formality
Formality,
that
like, we should be wearing a business suit at home or something.
right. Yeah. Like, if I say, "Call me Aubrey," please call me Aubrey, because
Yeah.
then it's a little awkward.
Right. So always listen, always listen to what people want, and don't be afraid to tell people how they should call you, right? What they
Yes.
should say.
Yeah. So
Yes.
let's go into for adults because, if you live in the United States or if you're traveling in the United States and you're at a conference,
Mhm.
often sort of it's made easy because when you're introduced to someone, however you're introduced, that's what you can call them, right? If it's this
Mm.
is Mr. Smith, then hello, Mr. Smith, nice to meet you. If it's like
Yeah, that's
this is
handy.
John, you'd be like, hi, John,
Yeah.
nice to meet you, right?
Right.
Then you don't have to worry about if they're introduced by a certain name. But what about, Lindsay, if you know their name, but haven't been introduced, when you go to greet them, what would you say?
Oh, if I know their name, but I
But haven't
haven't
met them
been
yet. Yeah.
formally introduced, good question. Like, for
Like,
example,
maybe
like
they have a
someone kind
name
of
tag,
famous or
or maybe they
something.
were a keynote
A
speaker, so you
keynote speaker,
happen to
right,
know
right.
their first and last name.
Yeah.
What do you
I would
think?
I think it depends on the industry. If we're thinking about a conference, I just came back from the podcast conference. It's still a very small industry and a casual, young, hip, techie industry. I would go with the first name.
Mhm.
I would go with the
Yeah.
first name.
I think so
Mhm.
too. I think it really depends on the situation, right? The
Mhm.
industry, the age of the person, because I feel like anyone who's maybe 50, 60, and above, I still
Mhm.
would potentially say, "Oh, Mr. Smith, so nice to meet you," if they're older,
Right.
because I do feel like
Right.
this is
Right.
changing
Right.
as with modern times, with more modern industries, we're more likely to use a first name. But with someone like my
Yes.
dad's age, I think he would
Yeah, I
still
agree
expect
with
to
you.
be called, Mr.
Mister Sure.
Jones.
Or if you meet someone's grandparent, you would
Yes,
definitely like, if you go visit a nursing home with someone's grandparent, you would definitely be referring to everyone with their last name unless and until they say, "Oh, no, call me Jane," or something.
exactly, right? So I
Mhm.
think a good takeaway is to err on the side of being overly respectful
Mhm.
until they clarify, right?
Yeah.
So you like you were saying, depending on the industry, if it's and if you're about the same age, absolutely you can use the
Yeah.
first name, but it
Yeah.
wouldn't be wrong. It wouldn't be offensive to say Mr. and use their last name, and then they absolutely can say, "Oh, call me John." No big deal, right?
Sure. Sure, sure, sure. You can never go wrong by being too polite. It's the key
Mhm.
is, do you listen to when they correct you, and do you mirror that? Do you do it correctly after that, right?
Right, exactly, or do you feel like that's too informal? Do you still feel like, "Ooh, I should still use their Mr. and their last name," but I feel
Right.
like my personality, if anyone ever says, "Oh, call me Larry," even if they're 80 years old, I'm absolutely gonna call them Larry. Because I want to be more on a friendship level with anyone I'm
Yeah,
talking to, right? The
sure.
only What about a job interview? What do you think, Lindsay? One of the most formal scenarios I can think of. You meet
Mm.
them, you say, "Hello, Mr. McIntyre, thank you for taking the time," and he says, "Call me Larry."
I would probably still revert back to the Mr. McIntyre, to be honest. I might not say the name that many more times I might say it like 1 or 2 more times. So if we use
Mhm.
the name too many times, it's weird in a short period of time if it's just an
That's such a
interview.
good point, right? And that is
Yeah.
something that's an error a lot of people make that you guys want to
Mm.
avoid, right? They might say, "Oh, call me Larry." You're probably not going to need to, whatever you're saying, "Oh, and then Larry, I did this," and that, right? You just
It
aren't
can
going to
feel
need
very
to say it.
creepy. Yeah, it can feel weird. But yeah, I would probably just go yeah, I would probably finish off the interview. "Thank you, Mr. McIntyre, again for the interview. It's been great meeting you." Something like that, to be
Yeah,
honest.
and
I
then they
probably
might
wouldn't go to
say
Larry.
that
Yeah.
old trope that's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, Mr. McIntyre was my dad. Call me
Oh
Larry."
gosh, yeah.
I have definitely heard that. But yeah, so I agree, especially for an interview, you're really trying to stay professional, respectful. So I think
Yeah.
that is one situation where I would also continue with the very respectful titles.
Yes.
And then maybe
Yeah.
the second time you meet them, it would be
Yeah.
different.
For sure, for sure. Okay, Aubrey, should we go into a role play for today? What do you
Yeah,
think?
let's do a little role play. So I'm playing the part of Anne because we need to be people who don't know each other. I'm meeting
Okay.
my friend's mother, Lindsay. You're a little bit older than me in this role play. Your name's
Okay.
Sharon. We're meeting for the
Sure.
first time.
All right. Very good, very good.
All right, I'll start
I'm
us out.
ready. Mhm.
Hello, Mrs. Fredrickson. It's so nice to finally meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you. You can call me Sharon.
Oh, thank you for inviting me to dinner, Sharon. I brought this bottle of wine.
Oh, that's so thoughtful of you.
It's funny, as I said that, "Thank you for inviting me to dinner, Sharon." I'm trying to think, what would I say her name right away like that to
Mm.
reinforce, like, she's asked me to call her first name, so I'm going to do it right now to show, like, "Oh, we have this sort of bond
Yeah.
now," right? We've broken down that wall because there is also we don't need to say it right away. She knows her name is Sharon, right?
I think it shows confidence. I don't think it sounds awkward. I see what you mean, like, she knows her name is, but I think it kinda sounds like, "Yeah, I've heard you. I respect what you asked for, and now I'm just putting it back into context of my response." You
Yeah,
know?
I feel like too,
Yeah.
because there is something for when someone says, "Go ahead and call me by my first name," there
Mhm.
is this sort of acknowledgement of that if you then are able to say it right away. And it
Yeah,
does
it
sort
shows
of tear down that
confidence.
wall of formality, which is
It
good.
does. It shows that you have the confidence to go and just actually take action on that and do it because it's
Hmm.
kind of safer to stick with the more distance building way of referring to someone by their last name, isn't it? It's kind of safer in a way.
Yes,
Ugh.
exactly. This is
Yeah.
such an interesting conversation. I know this is different in the United States culture than it is in other countries and other cultures, and even within the United States, right? It's different in the
Mhm.
South, it's different in New England. So I think one really important takeaway is that you're going to want to read the room, as we say.
Read
Wherever
the
you
room.
are, whoever you're with, listen to what they call each other. You can start with the more formal of, Mr. Anderson,
Sure.
Mrs.
Mr.
Anderson, and
Mrs.
then give
Mhm.
them the chance to tell you what to call them. But I
Yes.
think especially like with Hawaii, with places that do have sort of their own cultural language, cultural norms, you can learn a lot just by observing and listening to other people's conversations.
Yeah, it's so key. I love the Hawaii example because it is a very different culture, and it's so important to know we have different cultures. You're
Yeah.
right. New England is so different from the South, is so different from the Mountain West, is different from Hawaii or the Midwest. So think about that. I mean, be a good listener, right? Be a good listener. Respond, listen to what they want, what they ask for, and actually
Mhm.
have the confidence to follow up and do it correctly as they ask. That's a really important key too.
Absolutely right. Knowing and anticipating these cultural differences is such a vital key to connection, right? You don't want to sort of build up this wall or break the connection before it's even had a chance to start. So the way you greet someone, what you call them is
Yeah.
important. This is definitely important to think about and notice wherever you're traveling or wherever you live.
Yeah, I think in another episode, Aubrey, we could get into, how do you know whether if you don't necessarily you know their last name, but you don't know if it's a Miss or a Mrs., right? How do you
Mm.
know where to start there? All of that stuff around. There's also Ms., which I don't know if that even exists anymore or if that was just in the 80s.
That's a good point, right? I feel like this is all really evolving, and a lot of you might be confused out there, so let's definitely do an episode on that soon, Lindsay. That would be fun.
That would be cool. It'll be an interesting one to plan for sure. All right, good stuff. Thanks, Aubrey. I'll talk to you soon. Have a good one.
Awesome. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.